In this video, we're talking about spironolactone, which is a potassium-sparing diuretic that works through blocking aldosterone, which is a steroid hormone that's secreted by the adrenal cortex. So if we look at the adrenal gland, these are above the kidneys. You have the adrenal medulla where epinephrine, norepinephrine is made. And then you have the adrenal cortex where the outer layer is called the zona glomerulosa. And the zona glomerulosa has cells that produce aldosterone in response to angiotensin II, or maybe low sodium levels or high potassium levels. But once aldosterone is secreted, it enters the bloodstream, travels to the kidneys, and specifically it travels into the nephron. So we have millions of nephrons in each kidney, and each nephron has a proximal convoluted tubule, a loop of Henle, a distal convoluted tubule, and a collecting duct. We're talking about this area right here where you have the end part of the distal convoluted tubule where it meets the collecting duct. This is where aldosterone receptors are found. So if we zoom in and we look at the tubes are lined by cells. They're simple cuboidal cells. So if you look at a cross section, it'll look kind of like this, where you have one layer of cuboid shaped cells. Now, if we look at it more kind of longitudinally, it'll look like this. But to orient you, we have the peritubular capillaries out here, our bloodstream, and we have the filtrate, the inside of the tube right here. So anything that goes from the bloodstream to the filtrate inside the tubule is going to end up being urine, and it's called secretion. Anything that's maybe being taken from this side, the filtrate side, and pushed over through the cell into the capillary, that's called reabsorption. So we're reabsorbing some things based on different hormones and stuff like that. In this case, it's aldosterone. So we have two different cells found up here. One's called a principal cell. One's called an alpha intercalated cell. Now, aldosterone enters this alpha intercalated cell. And because it's a steroid hormone, which is a lipid, it just moves right through the cell membrane like it's not even there, binds to that receptor, and translocates into the nucleus, binds to a hormone response element, so it actually is bound to the DNA and it increases transcription. That makes it a transcription factor. So it's going to increase transcription of some proteins, 4 different proteins that we're going to discuss in this video. The first one we're going to discuss is this ATPase that pumps protons or hydrogen ions into the filtrate. So since it's going against the concentration gradient, we need some ATP. So it's ATPase. It's pumping that protons into the filtrate to be excreted. It'll usually bind with a phosphate in here to kind of buffer it, and then it gets excreted. So that is one protein. That's in the alpha intercalated cell. Now in the principal cell, when aldosterone goes in and binds to the receptor, moves into the nucleus and increases transcription of 3 more proteins in this cell. First being sodium potassium ATPase, which is a protein that we see in every cell in the body. It creates this huge concentration gradient with sodium outside the cell, potassium inside the cell, and so it's going to increase the amount of those proteins in this particular tubular cell. So we're going to get more sodium pushed out into the bloodstream, more potassium from the bloodstream going into the tubular cell. So we're going to have more of that going on when aldosterone is binding and present. So this third one, the third protein that gets embedded into this side of the membrane, the filtrate side of the tubule, is called a sodium channel. And so if we have all this sodium being pushed out, then there's not much sodium in the cell. So sodium in the filtrate's higher. So it's just going to go down its concentration gradient into the cell, and then it's going to get pumped into the bloodstream, and that's called sodium reabsorption, secondary to aldosterone. And then a third channel here that's in this cell, so the fourth total channel or protein that's being made, this one is a potassium channel. So potassium's getting pumped from the blood into the tubular cell, so we have a lot inside the cell. There's more inside the cell than there is in the filtrate within the kidney tubule. So that means when you insert a potassium channel, potassium is going to go down its concentration gradient into the filtrate and get excreted. So ultimately, aldosterone is going to increase sodium in our bloodstream and decrease potassium. It's also going to help us to eliminate acid. The body, a lot of times, is dealing with acid more than base, and so it's kind of nice that it can help get rid of those protons. So We have spironolactone and eplerenone that work by blocking the receptors of aldosterone in the tubule cells. If you block this receptor, you're preventing this protein from being made, which means that you're not secreting as much acid or protons into the filtrate for excretion. So that begs the question, side effects. We could have metabolic acidosis. If aldosterone levels are high, or if we're blocking aldosterone and we don't have this being made, acid or protons are going to kind of build up in the bloodstream, and that could lower our pH below 7.35, and then we would call it metabolic acidosis. And that's something you have to monitor when you have somebody on spironolactone or any potassium sparing diuretic that blocks aldosterone like eplerenone. Okay, so another possible side effect, if you block this channel from being made, then you're going to have a backup of potassium. Potassium's usually coming through when you have aldosterone present, but if you're blocking aldosterone, you're going to prevent the insertion of the potassium channels, which means potassium can get backed up. That's why I call it a potassium sparing diuretic, as it spares that secretion of potassium. And so if you have high potassium in the blood, that's called hyperkalemia, and that's another side effect that you have to be aware of and monitor whenever someone's on a spironolactone, because usually in our blood the potassium is between 3 and 5 milliequivalents per liter. So if it's higher than that, that's considered hyperkalemia, and that's something that could be detrimental to our heart conduction. And so you can look at ECGs and monitor the blood potassium and all of that. So that's some side effects you can see. Let's talk about indications. If aldosterone causes us to increase our sodium, when antidiuretic hormone is present, it's secreted by the posterior pituitary, and it has receptors here in the principal cell. And when it's present, it'll insert aquaporins, and you get this water following the sodium. You know, sodium has a strong osmotic effect. So if sodium is being increased in our bloodstream, so is water. When you increase the volume in the blood, you increase the blood pressure. So aldosterone increases blood pressure in that way. If you block aldosterone, you block the reabsorption of sodium, and you don't get that same blood volume increase, and you can actually decrease the blood volume, decrease the blood pressure. So that's one of the indications is for hypertension or high blood pressure. You can use a potassium sparing diuretic. A lot of times they may use a little bit of that with a little bit of hydrochlorothiazide, and then that will kind of, hydrochlorothiazide causes potassium to, wasting. So if you got a potassium sparing and potassium wasting, maybe you can kind of balance it out where you don't get hyperkalemia or hypokalemia. You can kind of get it just right, kind of a Goldilocks effect with hydrochlorothiazide and spironolactone. And then another indication is Conn syndrome. So if someone has a tumor of their adrenal gland, specifically in that zona glomerulosa, they're going to crank out more aldosterone. So you need to kind of counteract that with an aldosterone blocker to prevent that extreme hypertension and increased blood volume. And then, if somebody has a myocardial infarction, a lot of times they'll have heart failure. Blood will back up into the lungs, and then they have this congestive heart failure where it's hard to breathe, and you can pull some of that water off. A lot of times they'll use a heavy hitter like a loop diuretic, like Lasix, and then they'll come in with some potassium sparing diuretic too, because that way you kind of get that balance again, because the loop diuretics will cause more potassium to be excreted. And then you have the potassium sparing diuretics that cause more potassium to be prevalent in the bloodstream, so you can get that balance again. Same thing if you kind of have right-sided heart failure. The blood's backing up into your, you have that jugular venous distension. You could have ascites, swollen abdomen. You could have peripheral edema where you have more blood in your extremities. And so you could also use the loop diuretic and potassium sparing diuretic to kind of work on that as well. So Another thing, if you have these side effects, there are some potassium-sparing diuretics that just block the sodium channel and the sodium potassium ATPase. They don't do anything with this down here, so that could be an option. Those are called triamterene and amiloride. Those are two potassium-sparing diuretics that don't block aldosterone. Instead, they just block these channels, the sodium channel and the sodium potassium ATPase, the principal cell. And then we have the aldosterone blockers, spironolactone and eplerenone, that actually block all four of the proteins we discussed by blocking aldosterone. So I hope that helps you understand the mechanism of action of potassium-sparing diuretics, and we'll catch you in the next video.
Learn more about the human body. Subscribe, turn on those post notifications, give this video a big thumbs up. Bye.